Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Militarized Media Excavations at the Agitprop site on Mount Javornica. The project Printing Resistance, Archaeology of Media and Cultural Production during World War II in Yugoslavia was in part financed by a grant from the Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology, and the research was done within an international project, Heritage from Below, Drežnica Traces and Memories 1941 to 1945, focused on the region of Drežnica and its recent past. During the Second World War, the region was occupied and repeatedly attacked by Italian fascists, Nazis, and their local collaborators, Chetniks and Ustašas. The ferocity of these attacks, aimed mostly at the Serbian minority who comprised the majority of the area's inhabitants, expedited the local residents' alignment with the resistance movement, and included them in guerrilla warfare, which left behind a vast network of camps, safe houses and cave shelters across the area. After the war, Drežnica's role in the resistance movement will become an integral part of local identity as the community rebuilds their houses and their lives. While the majority of the sites tied to the resistance movement are marked by monuments and mentioned by local community memorialization ceremonies, the Agitprop, an indispensable cog in the resistance machine, retained its secrecy and distance from the local community. The site known as Agitprop, Agitation and Propaganda Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Croatia, is located on Mount Javornica, central Croatia. The Agitprop was one of the most important non-military spots in a wider partisan resistance real logistics network, particularly dense in the mountainous regions between Korenica and Drežnica. The Agitprop printing house was a mobile unit, but settled on this particular spot, an isolated place in the forest, between summer of 1943 and winter 1944. It consisted of several wooden huts and a dozen dugouts. The partisans smuggled machines and printing materials through an underground network of anti-fascist activists from Yugoslav towns into Drežnica, which allowed for the mass production of newspapers, magazines, and leaflets. The printing house was hidden in the forest, but was connected with headquarters and editors via a network of couriers. Despite the significance of this unit, little is known of how it actually functioned. Apart from written oral testimonies, there are no photographic records and very few original documents. There are some indications that the Agitprop site may have been destroyed in the attack by the Axis forces in the winter of 1944, during which the partisan hospital, located a few kilometers away, was also destroyed. According to some sources, parts of the equipment and the archives of the Agitprop were hidden underground before the attack in the vicinity of the camp, but were never found or recovered after the war. In the 1960s and 1970s, a number of sites connected to the resistance in the area was documented. Some were marked with monuments, and the sites, including the Agitprop, became part of a protected memorial area. With the breakup of socialist Yugoslavia, the change of political system towards right-wing politics, as well as the heritage politics turning right-wing in the early 1990s, partisan and anti-fascist heritage in Croatia was questioned, neglected, or even destroyed. The plans for the memorial area were cancelled and forgotten, and the whole Drežnica region, with a predominant Serbian minority population, has since been socially marginalized. Despite that, the glade where the partisan camp was located is still known as the Agitprop among the local population, and the same population provided several oral reports on the uncovering of lead printing letters in the pits surrounding the glade. Based on the Conservation Office documentation from the 1960s and the guidance of several local residents, the Agitprop site was located again in 2019 in the context of a community-based heritage project, Heritage from Below, Drežnica, Traces and Memories 1941 to 1945. The excavation campaign's objectives were to understand the Agitprop camp layout and to understand better the ways in which the Agitprop department was organized and how resistance printing houses function. The motivation was based on the fact that no systematic archaeological research was done on World War II resistance rear units camps, which were usually dismantled and destroyed already during the war. On the other hand, the excavation on this site was part of a bigger project focused on different narratives about the anti-fascist resistance, which are still relevant for the local community and wider society in Croatia and beyond. Field research was conducted in two phases with different methodological approaches. For one, there was a geophysical survey of the glade, and the aim of this was to define the outline of the Agitprop building to allow the identification of printing house as it was described by oral sources, and also the excavation of a printing house was expected to yield pieces of equipment that was used by it. The three trenches open at the site gave a significant insight on the inner workings of the resistant printing house, while the trench set up on the GPR surveyed area did not give much information. The second and the third trench did. The main takeaway from Trench 2 is that the site was heavily armed. The excavation yielded ammunition clips, pieces of armament, weapons, cartridge casing, and projectiles. No traces of the supposed burning were found, that is, no traces of ash or coal. But on the other hand, there was a suspicious amount of burned glass and exploded ammunition. We'll put a pin in that for now. It is also worth mentioning that the first two trenches did not bear any traces of printing activity. The third one did. A stack of papers was found, which is believed to be a part of the archives of the Agitprop. Also, during the survey of the area, over 100 types were found in the pit near the glade, which, along with the paper, confirms the presence of printing activity in the area. This survey that we did also found several defensive positions surrounding the Agitprop. They were built from stacked stone. The main issue with collecting this type of material in Croatia is that World War II archaeology is often sidelined. The layers connected to that era are quickly removed during excavations, and the material, if collected, often remains unpublished. It is not to say that there is no excavation of World War II sites in Croatia, it's just that their focus is mainly on remains of airplanes and ships on excavations done in underwater archaeology. Small finds and small sites found in local contexts, like the Agitprop, do not attract the attention of the scientific community, and the presence of amateurs with metal detectors who are interested in this sort of material makes contextualizing and cataloging these finds all the more difficult. The practice of collecting finds with metal detectors in Croatia is illegal. Therefore, there are ethical implications of collaborating with individuals who engage in those practices. All things considered, the issue of how to approach this material, which has no database or publication one can reference in Croatia, remains an open one. This paper will attempt to make a case for an analysis that uses collaborative methods and digital humanities approach. HEURIST is a research-driven data management system available both as a free service online and downloadable to a private server, and is focused on humanities. The material unearthed during the excavation this excavation is still relatively recent. The local population is still familiar with the uses of some of this stuff, which is incredibly useful during the entire duration of the project. However, the more specialized information, like the type of weapons or ammunition that we uncovered, could not be answered by our local partners. The database presented here will analyze 47 shells, mainly through head stamps that indicated manufacturers and dates, in order to understand war economies tied to the resistance movement. The database is, of course, still work in progress due to the diversity of the material, as well as the lack of references within the region that could enable the establishment of connections between different locations tied to the resistance movement. The work ahead will require more extensive archival work, interviews with witnesses and descendants of witnesses. The first step was indeed to create a type of artifact which did not exist in the database, so it should be created separately. Thus, the cartridge casing was born. The database is rather simple because at this stage of the investigation there are simple questions to answer. How did the resistance printing house operate during the war? It was obvious from the collected finds that the Agitprop was well armed. However, no one knew the inner workings of the Agitprop. Testimonies of witnesses were recorded in a few volumes after the war, but the sources on the topic remain scant. So the first data entry form just contains the number and the photo of the find. There is nothing new there. The next data entry form on the casings holds the information on the head stamps, whether or not they exist, if it's illegible, and so on. Illegible and partially illegible head stamps are planned to be sent to restoration, where complete information on them can be collected. This part is important because it can shine a light on war economies, where and how the resistance was supplying their weaponry. Out of 47 casings, 39 had a head stamp, and out of that 39, 27 had a full legible head stamp. The analysis has so far identified 8 manufacturers, the most common one being Società Metallurgica Italiana, an Italian manufacturer. Now, between 1941 and 1943, the territory of Drežnica was occupied by Italian fascists. The partisans were often engaged in actions against them, as well as supplied their troops through ambushes of Italian forces. So the presence of Italian casings is not that big of a surprise. The dates that are found on the casings are also interesting. The earliest one is from World War I, and the latest ones are from the early 1940s. Last data entry form holds information on the state the casing was found in. In this case, the most important category is exploded, like the casing shown in this example. This means that the casing was not in a gun barrel before it was destroyed. It was never fired, but it was exposed to high temperatures that set off a mixture of high energetic gases and generated a very high pressure inside the case. Considering the fact that the casing was not in a gun barrel, the path of least resistance was found on the wall of the casing. The result is an exploded casing, shown here. As was mentioned earlier, the Agitprop was presumed to be destroyed and set on fire in the winter of 1944. The state of these casings would be consistent with the fate of Agitprop recorded in the sources and local memory. The exploded casings would undoubtedly be a part of the printing house inventory, meaning they represent part of the economies of war. Out of 47 casings, 35 were recovered as exploded this way, meaning they could only belong to the inventory of the printing house. Again, it must needs be remarked that despite the abundance of exploded casings and burnt melted glass, as well as a great number of locks, hinges, and other potential parts of doors and windows, no remains of a structure were ever found. How was Agitprop getting its ammunition? From the documented partisan testimonies recorded in late 1960s, we know that the men in the village were recruited in Yugoslav Royal Army in April 1941, during the so-called April War. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia there capitulated very soon, and it was invaded by Axis powers. The local population was asked to put down their arms, but many of them did not do that. They kept their weapons as well as the ammunition, thinking that it will come in handy during the next war. And they were right. We also know that the local population has been avid hunters, a practice they have kept up to this date. All this makes possible the idea that some of the ammunition, namely that dating to World War I and the ones produced in Yugoslavia, could have been sourced from the area. The ammunition from Italy, Germany, and territories occupied by Germany could have made their way to Mount Javornica through guerrilla ambushes and battles for liberation of the territory carried out continuously throughout the war. One of the main strategies of the Yugoslav partisan warfare was the continuity of so-called liberated territories in mountainous areas such as Drežnica, which allowed for the functioning of rear warfare activities such as hospitals, recruitment camps, as well as printing and propaganda work. This was one of the keys to successful resistance and self-liberation in this part of Europe. Is this a representative sample of the Agitprop ammunition? The answer is we cannot be sure, but also probably not. According to one of the witnesses, Filip Maravić, who was a young partisan helping the evacuation of Field Hospital Navan 7, the evacuation was going through the glade where the Agitprop hut was. What he found was an abandoned house, complete with a sack of flour on the desk, a much-needed resource to the exhausted staff and patrons of the hospital. If the huts were abandoned preceding the attack, it is possible that these 35 shells are what remained after the evacuation of Agitprop. At the same time, the story of Agitprop says that the equipment and rations were habitually hidden in the dugouts. Now, what is mentioned as dugouts could be the natural pits that are formed in the karstic environment, and this theory was actually confirmed with the findings of the printing types in one such pit. Due to lack of time, the pit was not excavated, and considering this was the first excavation of Agitprop, it is possible that the rest of the arsenal is still hidden in the pits of Mount Javornica, or of course it is also possible that everything in the Agitprop was carried away by the staff. much work is still needed on both this database and archaeology of World War II and resistance printing houses on the territory of Croatia. Considering the fact that this was the first excavation of the Agitprop, that the information distribution of World War II material across Croatia is scarce, and that there are not many World War II sites to draw comparisons from, creating collaborative spaces like databases gives us an opportunity to not only to keep our documentation in line in a sustainable manner, but also to engage both experts and amateurs from their own computers. The work we do is available on social media as well, so if you have any questions about it, do not hesitate to reach out. This is also our ever-growing brilliant research team, and thank you all for your time.